A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. Imagine a storage medium so durable you could literally bake it in a kitchen oven at 500 degrees, toss it into boiling water, or scrub it with steel wool, and the data inside would remain perfectly intact. We are talking about a physical format that doesn't just outlast a human lifetime, but potentially outlast the Roman Empire several times over. We have this near-perfect archival solution sitting in research labs. Yet here we are in April 2026, and the world is still largely backing up its most critical data on thin strips of plastic coated in magnetic dust.
It is the great paradox of the digital age, Corn. I am Herman Poppleberry, and today we're diving into a prompt from Daniel about Microsoft's Project Silica and the quest for the eternal storage medium. Daniel's asking a really pointed question. Can quartz glass storage actually scale up before the sheer volume of global data makes it obsolete? We are looking at a world that is projected to hit over 180 zettabytes of data produced annually, and our current methods of keeping that data cold are starting to look incredibly fragile.
180 zettabytes. I can barely conceptualize a terabyte when it's filled with my blurry vacation photos, let alone a zettabyte. But before we get into the existential dread of data deluges, we should probably mention that today's exploration is actually being powered by Google Gemini 3 Flash. It's the model writing our script today, which is fitting since we're talking about the literal foundations of where models like this might be stored in the distant future.
It's a perfect match. And to set the stage for Daniel's question, we have to understand what Project Silica actually is. Most people hear glass storage and they think of a CD or a Blu-ray, but this is fundamentally different. A Blu-ray stores data on the surface, or in a couple of very thin layers just beneath it. Project Silica uses a femtosecond laser. That's a laser that pulses at 1/4 of a second to reach inside a thick slab of fused silica glass. It creates these tiny 3D structures called voxels.
Voxels, like pixels but with volume.
Precisely. And because the glass is thick, you can stack hundreds of these layers on top of each other. You're not just writing on the glass, you're writing inside the glass. It's like the difference between writing a note on a piece of paper versus engraving a message inside a solid crystal. Once those voxels are there, they are a permanent physical change in the molecular structure of the quartz. They don't fade like the dyes in a recordable DVD, and they aren't susceptible to the magnetic interference that can wipe a hard drive or a tape.
So it's the ultimate set-it-and-forget-it technology. But Daniel's point about the timeline is what really gets me. We've been hearing about this for a while. I remember the big splash back in 2019 when Microsoft stored the original Superman movie on a piece of glass the size of a drink coaster. That was 7 years ago. If it's so indestructible and amazing, why am I not buying a glass drive for my server rack yet? Is this just one of those forever 5 years away technologies?
That's the tension Daniel is tapping into. In 2023, we saw another big milestone when they partnered with Warner Brothers to archive The Wizard of Oz. That was a huge proof of concept for the film industry because, believe it or not, original film stock is terrifyingly fragile. But as of right now, in early 2026, it still hasn't hit wide commercial availability. The bottleneck isn't the glass itself. Sand is everywhere, and quartz is cheap. It's the physics of the write speed and the complexity of the reading system.
Right, because if I remember correctly, the Superman demo was only about 75 gigabytes. In an era where a single high-end game install is 100 gigs and enterprise data is measured in exabytes, 75 gigs on a coaster feels, well, it feels like a floppy disk.
It does, but the density is improving. The latest specs we're seeing for 2026 show a standard 12 centimeter glass platter holding about 4.8 terabytes. Now that's a massive jump from 75 gigs, but compare it to an LTO-10 tape cartridge which holds 18 terabytes natively. Tape is still the king of capacity, and it's a mature, moving target. Every time glass storage gets better, tape gets better too.
And tape is cheap. But tape has that bit rot problem you're always complaining about, doesn't it? You have to move it to a new tape every 10 years or so just to make sure the plastic hasn't degraded or the drive hardware hasn't become a museum piece.
That is the migration cycle, and it is the hidden tax on all modern data. If you're a company like Google or Microsoft, you are spending millions of dollars and a massive amount of energy just moving data from old tapes to new tapes. It's like having a library where you have to photocopy every book every decade or the ink will disappear. Project Silica's pitch isn't just that it holds a lot, it's that once you write it, you never have to move it again, for 10,000 years. That is a zero marginal cost archive.
Okay, let's dig into the how for a second, because I think the mechanics explain why this is taking so long to commercialize. You mentioned the femtosecond laser. That sounds expensive. Is it a situation where the paper is cheap, but the pen costs $1 million?
That is exactly the issue. A femtosecond laser is a highly specialized, sensitive piece of equipment. You can't just stick one in a consumer-grade external drive. These lasers work by creating nanostructures in the glass that change how light passes through it. To read the data back, you don't use a standard laser like a CD player. You use a computer-controlled microscope with polarized light. The microscope looks at the glass, sees how the light is being polarized by those 3D voxels, and uses machine learning to decode those patterns back into bits.
So the player is basically a high-tech lab microscope. That doesn't exactly sound like something that scales to a massive data center library with robots flying around grabbing platters.
Well, Microsoft is working on that part too. They are building these jukeboxes that use AI-driven computer vision to find and read the platters. But you hit on the write speed, and that's the real kicker. For a long time, writing to glass was incredibly slow, like 1 megabyte per second slow. If you're trying to back up a petabyte of data at 1 megabyte per second, you're going to be waiting until the next century just to finish the upload.
I've had internet connections like that. It's not a fun way to live. But I heard there was a breakthrough recently, right? Something about the type of glass they're using.
Yes, this just came out in February of 2026. Microsoft Research announced they've shifted some of their focus from pure quartz to a specific type of borosilicate glass, which is basically a high-tech version of Pyrex.
So we're storing the world's secrets in baking dishes now.
In a way, yes. The reason is fascinating. Pure quartz is very hard and requires a lot of laser energy to modify. Borosilicate is slightly more malleable at a molecular level when hit by the laser. This change has allowed them to significantly increase the write speeds. They're still not quite at the speed of writing to a modern hard drive, but they are closing the gap with tape. They did sacrifice a little bit of the theoretical maximum density, but in exchange, they made the technology much more manufacturable.
It's the classic engineering trade-off. You can have the perfect theoretical material that takes forever to use, or the good enough material that you can actually ship. But even with the borosilicate shift, we're still looking at 2027 for actual commercial integration into Azure data centers. Daniel's question remains, is 2027 too late? If data volumes are doubling every few years, will a 5 terabyte platter be a joke by the time it's ready?
It's a valid concern. If you look at the IDC forecast, the sheer volume of data is outstripping our ability to manufacture storage media, period. We aren't making enough hard drives or tapes to keep up with the world's cameras, sensors, and AI training logs. But Microsoft's counterargument is about volumetric density. Think about a tape library. It needs climate control because tape hates humidity and heat. It needs a lot of physical space for the robotic arms and the cartridges, which are relatively bulky.
And those glass platters are tiny. They're what, 2 millimeters thick?
You can pack them like thin slides in a rack. Because they don't need power to maintain the data, and they don't care about the temperature, you can turn off the air conditioning in the archive room. You can pack 10 times more data per square foot of data center floor space compared to tape. So even if an individual platter holds less than a tape cartridge, the entire library might actually be more dense and significantly cheaper to operate over a 50-year span.
I like the idea of a data center that's just a dark, dusty room full of blast slides that nobody has to touch for a century. It feels very Indiana Jones. But let's talk about the competition. Daniel mentioned optical archiving struggling to keep pace. We've had things like MDISC for a while, those 1,000-year DVDs. Why didn't those win?
M-Disc was a great step, but it was fundamentally limited by the DVD and Blu-ray form factor. You're still stuck with about 100 gigabytes on a triple-layer Blu-ray. For a consumer, that's fine for wedding photos. For a company like Warner Brothers or a National Archive, 100 gigs is nothing. You'd need millions of disks. Project Silica is aiming for the petabyte to exabyte scale. It's also about the read side. Blu-ray players have moving parts, lasers that burn out, and very specific hardware requirements. The Silica reading system is basically just a camera and a light. As long as we have the ability to build a magnifying lens and a digital sensor, we can read that glass.
That's a really important point for the digital dark age problem. If I find a floppy disk from 40 years ago, I don't just need the disk to be intact. I need a working floppy drive and a computer that can talk to that drive's specific controller. With glass, the data is physically there as a 3D structure. Even if the software is lost, you could theoretically reconstruct the data just by looking at the glass with a powerful enough microscope and working out the patterns from scratch. It's much more future-proof in a fundamental way.
It really is. It's the closest thing we have to the Rosetta Stone for the digital era, but let's look at the practical barriers for a second, because this is where Daniel's "will it be too small" question gets really pointed. Right now, the Global Music Vault in Svalbard is using this tech. They are storing master recordings of culturally significant music. That's a perfect niche use case: low volume, high importance, extreme longevity. But that's not the same as being the backbone of the cloud.
Right, the Global Music Vault sounds like a prestige project. It's a great headline, but the real money and the real data problem is in things like medical records, financial logs, and legal archives, stuff that has to be kept for 70 years by law, but is almost never accessed. That's the cold storage market. Is Microsoft actually going to convince a major hospital system to trust their records to glass platters instead of the tried and true IBM tape libraries?
That is the multi-billion-dollar question. And it comes down to the ecosystem. To replace tape, you don't just need the medium, you need the reliability. Tape has been the standard for decades. We know exactly how it fails. We know how to fix it. Project Silica is still the new kid in a world that is incredibly risk-averse. If a library robot drops a glass platter, does it shatter? Microsoft says no, these are chemically strengthened, but you can bet an IT director is going to worry about it.
I can see the oops moment now. Sorry, we lost the last 10 years of insurance claims because the robot had a glitch and turned the archive into confetti. Though, to be fair, I've seen what happens to a tape when it gets chewed by a bad drive. It's not pretty either.
Fair point. And Microsoft has actually done abuse testing where they drop them, bake them, and even put them in microwaves. The glass is incredibly tough, but the real hurdle is the write once, read many, or worm nature of it. You cannot erase a glass platter. You cannot update a file. If you make a mistake, that mistake is etched in quartz for 10,000 years.
That sounds like a nightmare for my typos. But for a legal archive, that's actually a feature, right? Immutability is a huge deal for compliance.
It's a feature for cold storage, but it means your data management software has to be perfect. You have to be absolutely sure that what you are sending to the glass printer is exactly what you want to keep forever. There is no undo button.
Let's talk about the cost, because Daniel mentioned the economics. Sand is cheap, but the process isn't. If I'm a CFO, I'm looking at the cost per gigabyte. Tape is incredibly cheap, sometimes less than a cent per gigabyte. Where does glass sit on that spectrum?
Right now, it's much higher because the lasers are expensive and the throughput is low. But Microsoft is betting on the TCO, the total cost of ownership. If you factor in the cost of electricity for cooling a tape library, the cost of the migration every 10 years, and the cost of the physical space, they argue that glass eventually becomes cheaper. But that eventually might be 20 years down the line. Most corporate budgets don't look 20 years ahead, they look at the next quarter.
That's the quarterly earnings trap. It's hard to justify a massive capital expenditure today to save money in 2046. but I wonder if the sustainability angle might be the tipping point. We're seeing a lot of pressure on big tech to reduce the energy footprint of data centers. If you can move 30% of your data to passive glass storage that uses 0 watts to maintain, that's a massive win for your carbon footprint.
You nailed it. That is a huge part of the marketing for Project Silica. They are calling it sustainable by design. Traditional storage is a constant energy drain. Even a hard drive sitting idle in a rack is drawing a tiny bit of power, and it's generating heat that needs to be pumped out by an air conditioner. Glass is inert. It's just a shelf of rocks. From a green IT perspective, it's the holy grail.
So to Daniel's question about whether it will be too small by the time it arrives, I'm looking at these capacity numbers again, 4.8 terabytes per platter. If the growth of data is exponential, and we're hitting zettabytes, 4 terabytes really does feel like a drop in the bucket. But I guess if you can fit 10,000 of those drops in a single rack, it starts to add up.
It does. And remember, we're talking about cold data. Most of the zettabytes being created are hot or warm data. TikTok videos that are watched 1 million times today and forgotten tomorrow, or real-time sensor data from self-driving cars. That stuff stays on SSDs or hard drives. Project Silica is for the frozen data. The stuff that we might need in 50 years, but we definitely don't need today. When you look at it that way, the capacity requirements are slightly different. You're not trying to store the whole internet, you're trying to store the heritage of the internet.
That's a good distinction. But even heritage, data is growing. Think about high-resolution medical imaging. Every year, the resolution of an MRI or a CT scan gets higher. The files get bigger. If you want to keep a patient's lifetime medical history on glass, you're going to need more than a few gigabytes.
True, and that's where the competition from things like DNA storage comes in. We've talked about that before, the idea of encoding data into synthetic DNA strands. DNA density is light years beyond glass. You could theoretically store the entire world's data in a couple of buckets of DNA.
Yeah, but then you have to deal with sequencing the DNA to read it back, which is its own slow, expensive nightmare. And DNA is biological. It can degrade if it's not kept in very specific conditions. Glass feels much more industrial strength compared to a bucket of synthetic goo.
I agree. Glass is the bridge technology. It's more dense than tape, more durable than anything we've ever made, and it's based on physics we understand. DNA is still very much in the science fiction phase for enterprise use.
So let's look at the takeaways for the people listening who are actually managing this stuff. If you're an enterprise IT person today, and you're staring at a growing mountain of data, what do you actually do with this information about Project Silica?
The first takeaway is, don't throw away your tape drives yet. For the next 3 to 5 years, tape is still your only pragmatic choice for high-volume cold storage. LTO-10 is here, LTO-11 is on the roadmap, and the economics are still unbeatable for most companies. If you need to store petabytes today, you're buying tape.
Right. Glass is currently a watch-and-wait technology. But you should be watching it, especially those partnerships like the Warner Brothers, One, or the Global Music Vault. Those are the canaries in the coal mine. If those projects start scaling up, it means the write speed problem is being solved.
And the second takeaway is to reevaluate your data retention policy. A lot of companies are hoarding data on expensive warm storage, like spinning hard drives, because they're afraid of the friction of moving it to tape. If Project Silica becomes a reality in Azure, it might change the math on what you decide to keep. You might move from keep for 7 years to keep forever because the cost of forever on glass becomes so low.
It changes the philosophy of archiving. Right now, archiving is a burden. It's a chore we have to do. If glass works, archiving becomes an asset. You're building a permanent, indestructible library of your company's history. That's a huge shift in mindset.
It really is. And for the individual, while we won't have glass burners in our laptops anytime soon, we might see permanent backup services as a tier in consumer cloud storage. Imagine paying a one-time fee to have your family photos etched into a glass platter in a Microsoft Vault, knowing that even if the company goes bankrupt or the internet changes forever, that physical object exists and can be read in 100 years.
I'd pay for that. I mean, I've already lost photos from 10 years ago because a cloud service changed its terms, or I forgot a password to an old account. The idea of a physical, permanent master copy that isn't dependent on a subscription model is really appealing.
It's the return of the physical artifact in a digital world. We spent 30 years trying to get away from physical media. No more CDs, no more DVDs, everything in the cloud. And now we're realizing that the cloud is just someone else's hard drive, and those hard drives are surprisingly fragile. Project Silica is the cloud finally getting a hardcover version.
I like that. The cloud now in hardcover. We should pitch that to Microsoft's marketing team. But seriously, Daniel's question about the data deluge is the one that stays with me. If we are producing data at a rate that outstrips our ability to build the machines to store it, we're effectively deleting our own history in real time. We're only keeping what we can afford to store.
That is the digital dark age. In a nutshell, we are the most documented generation in history, but we might leave the least amount of evidence behind because our paper is so temporary. If Project Silica can bridge that gap, if it can provide a way to store the essentials of our civilization in a way that doesn't require constant maintenance, it might be the most important infrastructure project of the 21st century. Even if the platters are small, by tomorrow's standards, the fact that they are permanent is what matters.
It's the difference between a high-speed stream and a stone carving. The stream carries more water, but the carving is what tells the story 1,000 years later.
Well said, Korn. I think we've thoroughly explored the courts of the matter here. Daniel, thanks for the prompt. It really highlights how the most futuristic solutions often involve going back to the most basic materials, like sand and light.
And thanks to our producer, Hilbert Flemingtop, for keeping the wheels turning. Also, a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power the generation of this show.
This has been My Weird Prompts. If you find yourself wanting to dive deeper into the technical specs of femtosecond laser etching, or if you just want to see those Superman glass coasters, check out the links on our website at myweirdprompts.com.
And if you're enjoying the show, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It helps other curious humans and sloths and donkeys find us in the vast, ever-expanding zettabyte-sized ocean of the internet.
We're also on Telegram if you want to get notified the second a new episode drops. Just search for My Weird Prompts.
Catch you in the next one. Hopefully by then Herman will have figured out how to etch his grocery list into a Pyrex dish.
It's for the sake of history, Korn. Future archaeologists need to know I was out of oat milk. Goodbye, everyone.
Cedar. This episode was produced using Google Gemini 3 Flash. Text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts.